Welcome to Resilience in Life and Leadership with your host, Stephanie Olson, speaker, author, addiction, sexual violence, and resiliency expert. Danielle Bernock founded 4F Media, Faith, Family, Friends, Freedom in 2014 to promote inner healing and personal freedom through the power of the love that heals, using all forms of media, beginning with her first book. And the following quote from the book has gone viral. Trauma is personal. It does not disappear if it is not validated. When it is ignored or invalidated, the silent screams continue, internally heard only by the one held captive. When someone enters the pain and hears the screams, healing can begin. And that is from Emerging with Wings, a true story of lies, pain, and the love that heals. Today, Danielle is an international award-winning author, speaker, podcast host, and trauma-informed self-love coach who helps men, women, and organizations emerge with clear vision of their value, take ownership of their choices, and chart a path for their purpose. Welcome, Danielle Bernock. Hello, and welcome to Resilience in Life and Leadership. Danielle, welcome to the show. I'm looking forward to talking to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited.
Absolutely. So now you're doing a whole bunch of amazing things that I want to hear about. But why don't you start with how you got to where you are today, your journey here.
My journey here. It's a very long journey.
Yes.
But the short story is I suffered a lot of childhood trauma. And later in life, when I had dealt with some of it, I sat down to write a book and put myself in counseling for that process. Learned the other half of the book while I was writing the book, in the healing journey.
Yeah.
Found that my journey resonated with people, and that led to me wanting to help them. Very short, condensed version.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is really what happens so often. So I love how you say learned the other half of your book, as you were going along. So tell me a little bit about that, as you're writing, because our stories, we don't know the end of our stories. We don't know where God's going to take us and things like that. So tell me a little bit about that. You're writing the book, and then what are you seeing?
Well, it was because I was in counseling.
Yeah.
I put myself in counseling because I was going to be revisiting the painful things from my childhood that I was aware of.
Yeah.
But it was in counseling that other things were discovered and uncovered and called out as something that needed to be healed from, instead of something that I had dismissed. I dismissed the majority of things that happened to me as a child. They were simply normal. They were difficult. They weren't a plane crash. They weren't a tsunami. They weren't the Sandy Hook massacre.
Right.
So I made them smaller in my eyes, and I needed to just suck it up and just get over it. I had authoritarian parents, which really fed into that. I learned I had something called childhood emotional neglect, although my counselor was not familiar with the term. I learned that term, and here we go again. I tease that Dr. Janice Webb, I'd like work for her marketing team or something, or that she should pay me for advertising.
There you
go. She has come up with, I don't know if she is the originator, I think so, of childhood emotional neglect, that term. But her book, Running on Empty, is, I think, revolutionary. How she unveils it in a way that you can really understand and look at your life and see if it does or does not affect you. I read that book and found myself in 3 of the categories. She has 12 different parenting styles that are neglectful, and then the healthy one. She uses a fictitious little boy, and he goes through the situation. He comes home and he has this wonderfully nurturing mother, and how, it ought to go.
Right.
And you could read that, and if you were emotionally neglected, you could just identify that, well, that was not me.
Yeah.
That
Right.
is not how it
That
would have
was
gone
not
down in
my
my house.
normal. Right. Exactly.
But then she goes through 12 other types, and I found myself in 3 of them. One of them is the well-meaning, but emotionally neglected themselves parents.
Yeah.
So they're doing what they know. That was one of the ones of mine. And that is one of the things I want to help people with in my journey a lot, because it's invisible. It's with abuse and various kinds of trauma, it leaves a mark that there's an incident or there's something that happened that
Right.
you know. So
Right.
you know this happened, you know you felt this, but with neglect, it's what's missing.
Yeah.
It's
So,
a vacuum. So you don't
right.
you can't look for what
It's not
isn't
tangible.
what
Mm-hmm.
so it's identified by the side
Right.
effects that you present in your life. And I grew up with that, and that fed into all the other traumas. They really snowballed quite a bit. And I didn't learn that emotional neglectful part of my life till I was writing the book and in counseling,
Yeah.
because that was one of the things that I said, well, I grew up, I felt like my parents didn't love me and I didn't feel like I belonged in my family. And I'm just going on and on nonchalantly. She went, wait a
Yeah.
minute. I'm like, what? She said, something went terribly wrong. I'm like, what do you
Right.
mean? She goes, children go to their parents. They normally feel loved by them. And she goes on and explains what ought to have been my experience. And I was like, really?
So, can you give an example of what emotional neglect might look like?
Well, first off, one of the things that Dr. Janice Webb is very careful to do, and I will be very careful
Mhm.
also, is no parent is perfect. And if you
Right.
screw up one time, you didn't screw up your kid.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
I
mean,
always say that I have, as I was raising my children, a college fund and a therapy fund at the same time, right? Because you're going to mess up.
and not everything will leave that mark, because it takes more than that. It's a pattern. A pattern, it could be, or it's either a pattern or it's something that is really deeply impactful.
Yeah.
And it also relates to the child, because every child has a different amount of nurture that they need.
Sure. Because
I'm
everyone's
I'm
different, right?
more of a highly sensitive soul. There's HSPs out there, highly sensitive people out there. I don't like own the label, but I am empathic and I am more sensitive. So I needed more nurture than probably someone who is more stoic
Right.
naturally in their personality.
Right.
Well, my parents were of the generation of children are to be seen and not heard. Shut up and stop crying, or I will give you something to cry about.
Yep. Yep.
My mother had communicated to me later she didn't cry because my dad felt that if she cried, she was trying to manipulate him.
Sure.
So emotions were not really allowed much in my family, except for
Okay.
my brother reminded me about how my dad used to yell at the dinner table, but I don't remember that. I
Really
disassociated. Yeah, I disassociated. I don't
interesting.
remember that.
Yeah.
But I guess he used to yell, and I guess I had 2 brothers. I guess my dad and my oldest brother used to yell and scream at each other at the dinner table. I don't remember that. But that is not emotionally healthy.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Exactly. And it's amazing how much our brain protects us from those things, that we can
Mhm.
block those things out.
Especially
And
children, that is a
right.
normal self-protective thing.
Yes.
And that's one of the evidences of an adult. If they look back on their childhood and they're like, I don't remember much of anything.
Wow.
Like it's, there's a lot you won't remember when you were young because you were young. I don't remember being 1 very much, or 2, because I don't know how the brain works in those memories. But
Sure. Sure.
no one remembers a whole lot of that because your brain was forming.
Right.
But if you look back and you see Swiss cheese, or you don't remember anything, chances are you were not emotionally present
Right.
for your childhood, and there's a reason for that.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, so really, when you're talking about emotional neglect and parenting, it can look very different for each child. So there might be some children in a home that might feel emotionally neglected, whereas others feel, it was okay. Yeah.
Talk to the siblings, and it's
Wow.
amazing when they talk to one another, how it is a different perspective with all of them.
Right. Right.
And what might have hurt one didn't hurt the other, and what, and then vice versa.
So tell me about your book and that journey, because I'm sure that was an extremely healing part of your story and what you were doing.
It is. It was. Like I said, I knew half of it. Chapter 9 is called The Bullseye. And I think this is where God protected me.
Yeah.
Because I knew the incident that is unveiled in chapter 9.
Right.
But I didn't know what happened in my soul. I knew that it hurt me. I knew it was bad. I didn't remember a whole lot about it, but diving into it, chapter 9, The Bullseye, deals with my public rejection in front of the church as a child. I was left on the front row.
Yeah.
Front row of the church all by myself after they'd called my entire class up in front, one at a time, reading their names, because I went through a whole process of becoming a member. My parents were no longer going to church, and that's a whole other part of the story. More of the neglect. Why was I going and not them? Especially that day I'm supposed to be getting welcomed into membership. Why weren't they there?
And how old were you?
10 or 11. So right there, that's something they weren't there for that.
Right.
But then trauma took place, because I was sitting there and they called everyone up one at a time to announce their name and stand with the pastor and be welcomed into membership. And I'm already suffering the emotional neglect. So becoming a member of the church was huge for me, because I didn't feel like I belonged at home.
Exactly.
I was going to belong at church.
Right.
I'm going to belong somewhere. Nope, not here.
Wow.
Left on the front row, just sitting there for the entire church to look at, left out.
And no one noticed that.
I have no idea. I don't
really
remember
hard
going
to
home.
understand.
I don't remember.
Yeah. Wow.
But the Lord showed me as I was writing this book, it's like the Holy Spirit, how I envision it. It's like I can almost see it. Like He took me like a little kid by the hand and just slowly, gently walked me to a place where He was going to show me something hard. Like, I got you, though. Was like, I got you, okay?
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
And He walked me there and He showed me what took place in my soul was the inversion of a lie. There's a Bible verse that says, everyone who comes to Jesus, He will in no wise cast out. But I left there believing that Jesus Himself had cast me out.
Right.
And I believed from that day forward that everyone would always reject me.
Wow.
And there were other traumas in my life growing up also. There was many deaths that took place in my growing up. And I had a trauma that was associated with my name. I legally changed my first name in 1988 because I have a trauma associated with that. And they all built on one another. That's why the name of that chapter is called Bullseye, because a bullseye is a highest point of effectiveness right in the center. You can't get any more precise than the bullseye.
Right.
And so it's like He opened up, this is why you have been struggling with this. And I went, oh, I mean, literally my mouth dropped open and I gasped when He showed me.
So I want to go back to something that I think is incredibly important, because you said that when the church rejected you, it looked to you, your perception was that Jesus Himself rejected you. And I think that is so common, because the church, I mean, let's face it, we're human and we mess up, right? And there is, and I personally believe that there is so much hurt and trauma in the church, because so many in the church are not willing to say, hey, I am not perfect. And so it adds to that. Can you talk a little bit about that and trauma in the church and the difference between being rejected by the people in the church and being rejected by Christ? That was loaded. That was a loaded
Yeah.
question right there.
Well, I was rejected by the people, but I was
Yeah.
too young to understand that.
Yeah.
As a child will process situations differently than an adult.
Yeah.
They are more susceptible to trauma. And I want to stop here for your listeners to define trauma. Trauma is not the incident.
Right.
Trauma is the wound that takes place in the brain. And in my case, in this particular place, the soul, because the Lord showed me that happened in my soul.
Yeah.
I had that expectation because a spiritual wound took place, not just a physical brain wound, because trauma wounds the brain physically, chemically, biologically.
Right.
That's why trauma is not intentional. No one can intentionally traumatize themselves.
Yeah.
But there's such a stigma attached to that word trauma. People don't want to own that that happened to them because it makes them feel inferior
Weak.
and
Yeah.
shameful. But that's a lie.
Yep,
That's
right.
a lie.
That's right.
It's such a lie. And trauma in the church, every bad thing that happens to people in the church is not necessarily trauma because of that reason, because it may have upset them or made them mad, or they would be like hurt their feelings. How deep the wound goes will be evidenced by how it plays out. Does it affect you later? Do you find it over here? Do you find it over there? And it will create a trauma response that will be separate from the incident.
Right. So how did that event, when you were sitting in that church, rejected, how did that event affect you and your relationship with the church, with the people in the church going forward? And then I would love to know a little bit more about your relationship with your family and how that emotional neglect, affected you and your family going forward.
Well, how it affected me with the church that day
Mhm.
is I didn't remember going home, but I still craved to belong.
Right.
And apparently they gave me the opportunity to earn my way, because I found out later, I didn't know any of this. My mother explained this to me later. Apparently my dad had called the church to find out what happened. And they
Okay.
had refused me membership because my parents weren't going to church. And so if they made me a member, I wouldn't go to church either.
Oh my gosh.
So
There's a whole story right there. Okay.
it's really kind of comical. But
Hmm.
they said that I could do these extra things. I could earn my way.
Oh,
And how that
oh.
affected me in my soul was what my child brain said to myself was, I have to earn God's love.
Yeah,
Which
absolutely.
is the complete opposite of the gospel.
Right, right.
So I had to take special classes,
Mm.
and then they made me a member on a Sunday night when no one was at church.
Wow.
And so far as I know, that was the last time I went to that church.
Oh, that's so sad.
So it's like they became a self-fulfilling prophecy after that.
Right.
And years later, after the Lord apprehended me and I came back to him. I could say apprehended because that's the word I use in my book, because he chased me. I didn't
Yeah.
chase him.
He's good at that.
Because he loves me, because
Yes.
he loves you who are listening.
Yes.
He lost my train of thought. Train will come around again on the track. It always does. When my husband and I got engaged, we went back to that church.
Mm.
I did it on purpose one time because I wanted to forgive and I didn't want any bitterness in my heart.
Wow.
So that was my I never did a 12 steps recovery, but I think you have to do stuff like that in there.
Mhm.
So I went to that
Yep.
church on a Sunday as an act of forgiveness.
Yeah.
I forgive this church, these people, whatever, I forgive
Yeah.
them. for that wound in my life. So I did go back one time, and that was the one time that I
Wow.
went back. So
How did that, uh, because forgiveness is a choice. Forgiveness is
mhm.
not necessarily a feeling. We don't feel all this, oh, I feel so forgiving. I mean, that very often does not happen. And so it is a choice. Tell me about that day and how that felt, and that, going back into that church, sitting in those pews, and
Well, they actually
literally
had
making a decision to forgive them.
Well, they actually had built a different sanctuary, so I didn't
Okay.
have to go in the same
Yeah.
room. I don't know if I would have remembered. I went, it felt very weird and odd because it had been years and years and years.
Yeah.
I was 20, I was 21 when I did that. So it had been a good 10 years since I had been there, and my now husband went with me. So I went to this place. It was weird and boring, and I hadn't been there in a long time. So I went really just with my heart kind of like inside myself going, okay, God, you're coming with me, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Kind of thing. Went in there, sat there. The people said hi or whatever. I don't even remember a whole lot of who talked to me,
Mhm.
if anyone remembered me, if I remembered them. And it was uneventful,
Yeah.
actually, but it was a line in the sand for me. It was a line that I'd drawn. And so I knew that I had done what I could do okay, I did what I know to do. You got to do the inner work, God.
Right. Right. Exactly. Which is usually not overnight.
It took many,
Yeah.
many years. Well, I didn't really understand the spiritual implication of what had happened till I was writing that book. I was
Yeah.
55 years old then.
Yeah. Yeah.
I started when I was 54, published when I was 55, but so
That's pretty
that was
quick.
many
That's
years
good.
later.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So how is the relationship with your family today?
I it's I'm laughing for a reason because my family was very small from the beginning.
Mhm.
I had one grandmother and one step grandfather. Neither are alive. I had a mom and a dad, and my grandmother died when I was 13. 2 months later, my dad died,
Oh, wow.
and I
Sorry.
was there for that, watching that awful thing take place.
Wow.
A few years later, I lost a friend, a childhood friend.
Mm.
And then 4 years after my father died, I lost my eldest brother.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That's horrible.
So
Yeah.
my dad he used to have two siblings, and he lost his mom, his dad, and his sister all before he was married.
My goodness.
He had one brother. So I had an uncle who was married, and they had one child who I had one cousin, which we got together when I was kind of young, but
Mhm.
then suddenly they left the picture, and I have no idea why.
Okay. Interesting.
And so what I have left of my family is I have a brother. So, I mean, going down, I have two children. I have 6 living
Yes. Yeah.
grandchildren, but
Yes.
you know,
That's awesome.
what I have of my family is I have a brother,
Yeah.
and we have become very close.
Oh, that's
We've gone
great.
through a long journey together because he has his own story, which is not
Yep.
mine to tell,
Yep.
but he helped me process my childhood a little bit. Also, I talked with him while I was writing the book, and that goes back to what we were saying earlier about one would be traumatized, one would not be,
Yes. Right.
because he's like, don't you remember this? I'm like, no. I'm like, don't you
Yeah.
remember this? No. Did you know
Yeah.
this happened? We shared stories, and it was quite enlightening. So,
It's amazing. Well,
but my
I
mother
love.
and I, we had a very rocky
uh,
relationship, but
yeah.
I want to honor her by sharing. After I'd gotten married, there was this one day she invited me to lunch, and she asked me if I wanted to be friends.
Hmm.
And I craved, relationship. I'd had
Wow.
all this lack. So I said yes. And we started a long journey of building a bridge between the two of us,
Oh, that's
which
neat.
led to, we were very close when she passed. And I had my deepest prayer answered was to be with her. I wanted to be with her. And I got to be sitting there holding her hand, singing to her when
Wow.
she passed. So
Oh,
we came through it. So my message here for who's listening is no matter what kind of trauma you have or what kind of emotional neglect you may have suffered, you can heal.
yeah.
Your relationships can be healed if both parties will
Yeah.
be participants,
Right.
cooperating
Right.
participants. But if one party is not cooperative, I'm sad, then that can't be healed because you can't have
Yeah.
a relationship all by yourself.
That's right. And really some can be, I think that's where that forgiveness piece comes in, because there are some relationships that you shouldn't continue. There are some relationships that probably really, when you're talking about severe abuse or things like that, that you need to separate from that person, but that forgiveness can still happen, which
Mhm.
really brings healing to you as an
Yes.
individual. So, oh, I love that. I love that story about your mom and your brother. That is really beautiful, because, and it really just shows how God can just take something that is so not of him and just turn it into something that's beautiful and a blessing.
Yes. I
So
love
yeah.
the definition of forgiveness from the book The Shack.
Mhm.
When I read this, it etched on my heart. Forgiveness is letting go of another person's throat.
Yeah. Yep.
That
That is true. That is true. Yeah.
I love that picture because
Yeah.
that's such an emotionally charged way of looking at it.
Right.
And
Exactly.
forgiveness is an emotional thing. It is a choice, but it
Yeah.
involves your emotions.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's
It can
not
be horribly
always easy
painful.
to do. Yes, exactly. So you then founded 4F Media. So tell us about that.
4F Media the 4Fs are faith, friends, family, and freedom.
Love that.
And I founded that to publish my first book because I was going to publish my book myself
Mhm.
instead of traditionally published, because they were going to buy it and then it would no longer be mine.
Right, right.
Now they don't do things so much like that, but back then I'm like, no, you're not going to own my story. It's my
Right,
story, because then I could never publish it or change it or update it or do anything with it.
right.
So I wanted to own my story. So I created a company so that I could publish that. And I was looking into media. I mean, it was a book. And so I was thinking, well, maybe I'll do something else later. I don't know. But I had no plans past that.
Mm.
But now it's reached into, I was blogging. I have a blog. I have other books. I have a podcast. I have a YouTube channel. So I am looking to share my message on all different kinds of media. And those are
Love
the
that.
4 things that are real important to me: are faith, family, friends, and freedom.
Yeah. Isn't that great how God set something up and you're like, I don't know, this is and he just puts it together. So I
Mhm.
love that. That is fantastic. So Danielle, how can people find you? What's the best way for people to find you?
My website. Everything can be accessed from my website. I'm on all the major socials, and I have my own YouTube channel and my podcast, Victorious Souls Podcast. But you can all find them at DanielleBernock.com. It's BERNOCK. Many people would jump to the thing of a BUR, but it's
But they're wrong.
BERNOCK.
Yes. Okay. And
So
we'll
that's why I
make
spell
sure
that. So
we'll make sure to have that in all of the notes of the podcast. I love your story. I love your resilience is what it is. So this is my final question for you. What does resilience mean to you?
I've written about this. Resilience is a big thing. And the most visual way someone can visualize me explaining it was take a spring in your hand and you push it together and pull it apart. That is resilience. It's the ability to be able to bounce back from something terrible or hard or difficult and be able to live life and thrive again after that. And there's different ways you can build resilience. I mean, it's something you can actually work on so that you can make it stronger inside of yourself. So it's not just something you have or you don't have, though some people do tend to be born with more of it than others, depending on their personality.
Yeah.
But I've written about it before because it is an important aspect, and the more resilience you have, the less likely you'll fall into trauma. But it
Right.
doesn't make you impervious to it, because
Absolutely.
trauma happens to even the strongest people. I mean, people who go to war in that, they are trained.
Yeah.
And I have a friend who I interviewed for my book, Because You Matter. He's a trauma coach. He was in the military. He was trained in resilience. I mean, his story was amazing, what he put himself through to build
Right.
resilience before he was done growing up. Yet still, he ended up with PTSD. So
Yeah.
it's not a guarantee, but it is something that you can add to your
Right.
life.
Okay, so not my final question. So now here, so talk about what that means to build resilience. How do you do that?
Well, one of the articles that I've written, I talked about 5 ways you can build resilience. One is building up your sense of humor. One way you can see if maybe you don't have such great resilience is, can you laugh at yourself? I couldn't laugh at myself for the longest time. I was so filled with shame that when anytime I did anything wrong or made a mistake, self-condemnation was just all over that.
Right.
There's no resilience in that.
Right.
So
right.
helping your sense of humor to grow is one thing that you can do to build resilience. Building healthy relationships is another way. Studies have shown that healthy relationships mitigate trauma.
Yeah.
And children, if they are going through what could be called a trauma exposure, it's a situation that could cause trauma. But if they are surrounded with love and nurture, they have the possibility of going through that and emerging without any trauma.
Right.
That's
right.
amazing.
Right.
So healthy relationships and unhealthy relationships oftentimes are a side effect of trauma.
Right. Exactly.
Codependence and the refusal of asking for help, because that's called counterdependence. Yeah. All kinds of different trauma responses. But there are many things you can do to build resilience. Those
great.
are 2 examples.
And we can learn more about that from your writings and your work. And so one more time, what is your website?
DanielleBernock.com. I also do coaching to help people. If you want someone to walk alongside you with that, you don't want to just read stuff, because sometimes, you want someone with you. Sometimes you want the privacy of it. Sometimes you want someone with you. But healing really happens within the confines of relationships. So you should find someone to help you, whether it's a friend, a pastor, a counselor. I'm not a counselor, or a coach, but you should get someone to walk that road with you, because we weren't created to walk through life alone.
No, we were not, definitely. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your story and just the amazing work that you're doing today. And you definitely are the picture of resilience. So thank you so much for just sharing who you are and helping others through the things that you've learned. It's just incredible. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for listening to Resilience in Life and Leadership. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening. Please share with anyone you think will benefit from this podcast.